welcome to our CIB W099 and W065 joint webinar. So today we're going to unpack metrics in construction with a focus on construction management, of which Yingbin will be speaking as one of the coordinators for W065, and Matt Hallowell as a member of W099 with a particular focus on health and safety. So we are exploring the concept of metrics, the fact that there is a saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But then there are other sayings like what gets measured gets managed. So the use of metrics is really quite complicated in terms of what we're doing. And of course, with the advent of big data and other things like that, we end up in a situation where we're getting more and more data thrown at us, but what we're doing with it, we really need to consider in terms of quality. So I'm going to invite our first speaker, Yingbin Fen from you've only just told me where you're from. At Western Sydney University, joint coordinator of W065. I'm sure Yingbin will share a little bit more, but I would now invite you to share your screen. Thank you, Dan. And let's see what you have to say about the wonder of metrics.
Thank you, Fred, for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Yingbin Fen. I'm social professor at Western Sydney University. I'm very delighted to take this opportunity to just introduce one piece of work in the space of measurement in management. So the work that I'm going to talk about is part of an industry research project around developing sustainable and resilient supply chains. So this research was developed by Australia's Sustainable Built Environment National Research Centre and supported by a number of industry partners. So one of the key research themes at the Sustainable Built Environment National Research Centre is sustainable procurement. And over the last 5 years, we have conducted 3 industry, government, academia collaborative research projects surrounding sustainable procurement. From those projects are from building the framework to measuring and benchmarking, and then to the climate-aligned procurement contracting practices. In today's session, I'll be focused on the measurement and benchmarking tool that we developed to assess an organization's capabilities to address the supply chain, sustainability, and resilience. So all of our projects were developed based on the assessment of industry challenges and needs. A series of project development workshops were conducted with various industry participants, including government, client organizations, supplier, contractors, and industry associations, in order to identify their challenges and needs around sustainable procurement. And those processes that just ensure that the research was developed in response to the challenges and the needs of the industry. I'll move on to introduce the project 2.86, developing sustainable and resilient supply chains. Why we developed this project? The sustainability issues have emerged as one of the most important concerns in an organization's supply chain. And many organizations have realized that the critical role of their supply chains when facing global sustainability challenges and the risks, and supply chain disruptions caused by crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. And a company's supply chain creates far greater social and environmental costs than its own operations. And that's why the purchasing power held by the client organizations are so important. The purchasing power will have a significant influence over their suppliers' business practices and sustainability outcomes. However, the issue is that relatively few client organizations are well prepared for working with their suppliers to address the sustainability challenges and the risks in their supply chains. The supply chain sustainability and the resilience can benefit not only the organization's own interest and those of their other stakeholders, but also the whole society and the planet. And here are just some key benefits that supply chain sustainability and resilience can bring to the client organizations. And those benefits will motivate the public and private organizations to move forward in their efforts to re-examine their corporate strategies, governance, and management practices, processes, and culture, and align their efforts towards building and maintaining a sustainable and resilient supply network. So building a sustainable and resilient supply chain involves an organization's efforts to consider the uncertainties in the supply chain and environmental and social impact of product and services throughout the supply chain. Well, the conventional supply chain management focuses on speed, cost, and reliability of operations, sustainability and resilience of supply chain management. The sustainable and resilient supply chain management will add to the goals of achieving environmental, social, and governance outcomes and addresses the uncertainties and disruptions. So the project, we have developed the 4 objectives of the project. The first objective is to develop a capability maturity model for clients to address supply chain sustainability and resilience, and then to demonstrate the application of the capability maturity model through case studies. And then the third one is to examine the impact of client or government-driven initiatives and innovations on supply chain sustainability and resilience. The last one is to propose strategies to enhance supply chain sustainability and resilience for the Australian organizations, including small to medium enterprises. But for this, for today's session, I will just focus on the capability maturity model for assessing the client organizations' capabilities. As we know that client organizations, they play a very important role in building a sustainable and resilient supply network. For those organizations who have high environmental, social, and governance ambitions, supply chain sustainability and resilience are no longer just something to monitor or report. They are also something to be proactively and systematically integrated and addressed in their corporate strategies, governance, management practices, processes, and culture. So what the client organization need to do is that they need to consider how they can improve their capabilities and prepare themselves for building and maintaining a sustainable and resilient supply chain. And our research project has developed a framework for improving client organizations' capabilities in addressing their supply chain sustainability and resilience, with a focus on 6 interconnected organizational and management processes. In those, like, for example, the leadership and the strategy, which is focused on organizational priorities, strategies, plan, and management commitments to sustainability. Risk and opportunity is focused on risk governance and how sustainability risks and opportunities are identified, assessed, and managed. Organization and management focused on organization's governance, resources, people and culture, complexity and change management, and stakeholder engagement. Procurement processes are focused on the integration of sustainability and resilience into the procurement lifecycle. The alignment and integration focused on the alignment with the the alignment with and integration between internal business functions, alignment among partners in the supply chain, and the upstream and downstream supply chain integration. And the last one, the data and the knowledge focused on the collection, analysis, and reporting of data, use of intelligence and analytical capabilities, and the knowledge sharing within and beyond the organization. And organizations must have the opportunity to understand and assess their performance and prepare in the 6 key organizational and management processes for addressing their supply chain sustainability and resilient issues. So the next question is, how can the organization's capabilities in these key organizational and management processes be assessed? And we adopted the approach of maturity modeling. So the maturity model just describes the development of specific capabilities within an organization over time. So the model draws upon literature, some current practices, and collective knowledge and experiences of practitioners from government agencies, client organizations, and contractors, consultants, and industry associations. So the aim of the capability maturity model is to promote a holistic approach to enable change and continue improvement for client organizations. And this model is underpinned by the idea that an organization has the capability to determine its ability to build and maintain a sustainable and resilient supply chain. And as I mentioned, we have identified 6 capability areas or enablers that an organization should develop in addressing their supply chain sustainability and resilience. And then the organization's performance in each of the capability areas was evaluated against the 4 maturity levels from reactive to proactive. Let's just take the capability area number 5, alignment and integration, for example. So the 4 maturity levels are defined. On the reactive level, supply chains are organized functionally with a very low degree of integration. They are characterized by high duplication of activities internally and externally, disconnected process, and limited coordinated efforts with suppliers and partners. And there is little visibility into partners or suppliers' operations. The maturity can then be progressed to defensive, accommodative, and proactive levels over time with appropriate actions being undertaken. So on the proactive or optimized level, the organization is fully aligned with their supply chain partners on the key value dimensions across the extended enterprise. The individual strategies and operations are guided by common objectives, and their supply chain is fully flexible to interact and adapt to complex dynamic environment. And emerging value chain patterns are explored and identified. And to the right of this slide, there are some the relevant actions are also recommended to help the organizations to progress to the higher maturity level. And this is the typical process of conducting the maturity assessment for our industry partners that involve the 4 steps: setting up the meeting and determine the priorities and target. And then we conduct a diagnostic assessment. We review the documents and conduct interviews with the relevant people and distribute surveys. And then the 3rd step is the data review and analysis. We analyze the data and develop the rating for each capability area, and we make the recommendations. Then the last step is to prepare reports and obtain feedback. In this project, we have developed a practical and comprehensive maturity assessment and benchmarking tool to guide the implementation of the maturity assessment. So this tool covers the 6 capability areas, 4 maturity levels, 106 recommended actions, and instructions for assessment, and notes for assessment, evidence of action taken, and visualization of assessment results. And this tool can be used as the self-assessment tool, or could be used by a third party to make independent assessment. And by using this tool, the numerical values can be assigned to each capability area against each maturity level, so that internal benchmarking and progress over time can be made. And actions that are colored according to whether they are relevant to the organizations, whether they have been started or completed, and results are automatically input into and visualized in the summary table. And in this way, the organizations will be easily identify what actions need to be taken to progress to the next maturity level in each capability area. And in the future, these two will be further developed into a web-based self-assessment tool, so that more data can be collected to enable external or industry benchmarking. I'm not going to present the details, but the next 3 slides just include some high-level description of the maturity levels for each of the 6 capability areas. And if you're interested to know more about these two, so you can find from our project website. And we conducted case studies with Main Roads Western Australia and BGC company to test the maturity assessment and benchmarking tool. This is the visual presentation of the outcomes of the assessment for Main Roads Western Australia on the capability area number 3, organization management. So the Main Roads Western Australia, they have achieved the overall score of 8 in this capability area, which indicate a accommodative or defined maturity level. Main Roads Western Australia is able to engage key internal and external stakeholders in sustainability and risk governance. Their organizational culture and governance arrangement support the achievement of positive environment and social outcomes, sustainability, capability building, and complexity and change management. So although they are more matured, they have more matured organizational and management practices and processes in addressing supply chain sustainability and resilience, the efforts are required to ensure the implementation of those completed initiatives and actions as shown in the green labels. So the green labels just to show they have initiated some practices, but hasn't been completed. In the Main Roads Western Australia, is also recommended to initiate further actions as indicated by the orange label in order to progress to a more matured level. In the assessment of procurement and the process for Main Roads Western Australia indicated a less mature stage in this capability area. And the results showed that the Main Roads Western Australia has initiated the majority of the proposed actions for maturity level 1 and maturity level 2, which have only been partly completed to date. And this is the outcome for the case study with BGC. And we conducted assessment on capability area number 4, procurement and process for BGC. And the results of assessment indicated that the company was at less mature stage in procurement and process. Overall, the company has begun to take formal actions to address sustainability issues in their supplier assessment and selection and contract management processes. But there a lot to follow up, as indicated in the green labels, and some important actions that they agreed are important and should be taken in the next stage. So we expect to create values to our industry partners as well as the wider industry and community. There are some benefits. For example, with these two, we are able to provide a roadmap for continuous improvement, how an organization can progress from less matured to more matured practices. Benchmarking, compare the performance and see the progress over time, compare their practices against the industry best practices, as outlined in the accommodative and optimized levels. And they're able to red flag areas for improvement, prioritize the interventions, and identify the action plans. And the two can also help to educate staff and build organizational capabilities. So to conclude, I'm just going to show a short video about what our partners say about the values of the product of our project. I'll jump to
The Sustainable Built Environment National Research Centre is a unique blend of industry, government and research partners working across Australian industry with key links internationally.
Right now, we're in the middle of a climate and biodiversity crisis. So how we work together to take the global goals and turn them into scalable solutions, often driven by procurement, has never been more important. We need to work together as academia, industry and government to take this change and drive it at scale.
This project examined the approaches to improve supply chain reliability in private sectors to achieve their sustainability goals.
The value of Project 2.86 was we were able to do a real-life organisational level case study with the research team that was able to examine the different elements of sustainable procurement that was embedded within main roads. So we were able to take what we had actually done in practice and see how that aligned with the framework that was developed by the research team, and the feedback that we were able to get from the project has meant that we can identify any gaps in how we can improve our practice. And that's ultimately important for sustainability because we're always looking to improve what we do as an organisation, so then we can do the right thing by the community as well as the broader environment and achieve different outcomes when it comes to our procurement practices and our major project infrastructure investments.
The benefit of the sustainable and resilient supply chain project from a procurement perspective is Main Roads as a state government agency has a number of obligations other than delivering government's objectives. We have a corporate obligation to sustain industry and build industry. What this project did from my perspective is map out a process on how to actually do that, which is something as the head of procurement in Main Roads I've never had the opportunity to do. One of the other outcomes was a rating tool which was developed by Yingbing, which it was a self-assessment tool on how well agencies or organisations do sustainable procurement, and that was a real eye-opener for me because it was clear to us that Main Roads as an agency was very reactive and was not proactive in terms of taking steps to ensure a sustainable supply chain. So I got some great benefits out of that process. The other benefit for me was it was great to be part of the project team, because there were participants from different sectors. There also were participants from the private sector, and as an agency that contracts, it's not often that we get the opportunity to get private sector perspective on what their view of supply chain or supply chain resilience is. So it was an excellent opportunity to be involved in that team, and also to have the academic expertise that sat behind the project as well.
The Office of Circular Economy.
Academic expertise that sat behind the project.
So it's great to hear some of the positive feedback from industry partners, and great to know that some of the work that can produce some real benefit to the organizations. So we always acknowledge the support by the centre, including their core members, the ATCO, BGC, Western Australia Government, Queensland Government, and the university partners, Curtin University, Griffith University, Western Sydney University, and RMIT universities. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And over to you, Brett.
Okay, thank you so much, Yingbin. I certainly have a few questions around that, but I'm going to let Matt jump in now and share some thoughts about metrics in safety. But let's have a look at a different aspect of that, and then I certainly have questions for you, Yingbin. So we'll get some discussion going afterwards. Matt, over to you, sir.
All right, can you see the screen okay?
Yes, sir.
Me all right? All right. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be with you. Apologies for my voice. I'm on the tail end of what I hope is the tail end of a cold. So I'll do my best to hold the cough in for the end. So thanks for that presentation, Yuming. One of the things that stood out to me was the collaboration of, industry, government, and academia, which is quite cool. Something that we're also working on stateside in the area of safety, trying to get more stakeholders together in the research and development process. So kindred spirits there. So in this talk, Fred asked me if I'd talk a little bit about safety measurement. It's been a big topic of study for our research center for the last 5 years. In fact, the Construction Safety Research Alliance that Fred and I work at here at the University of Colorado was largely built on the back of the study that I'm going to share with you today that's focused on metrics. So I wanted to just start with a kind of a big picture question of why do we measure safety, right? And Fred mentioned a few good quotes to start the session of, what gets measured gets managed. I've also heard what gets measured gets manipulated, right? So metrics, once they become targets, can oftentimes be, the agents of bad behavior. So I want to think a little bit about why we measure safety, for example, at all. And I'm taking the perspective here of industry for a moment. Why would companies bother measuring safety? And I think part of the answer is that, it's an indication of, the fact that we measure it at all is an indication that companies find it to be important, right? But at the same time, if we think about using safety metrics for improvement, there really seems to be two major bins. We use it for comparing, and we use metrics for learning. Ideally, we would use metrics for learning, but I think what we find in practice, at least in the US, is that most of the use of safety metrics is for comparison, to see how did I do, maybe as a company from one period to the next? How do we do, how did one project do versus another project? One business unit versus another business unit tends to be used for comparison to judge who's best, right? Or what period is best. And I'd argue, you know, the way that we currently measure safety primarily isn't so good for comparing or learning. And so I'll share with you, I'll kind of unpack that a little bit with you, you know, what the predominant metric is and why it's perhaps not ideal for comparing or learning, and then share an alternative that, you know, we're knee deep in developing and testing and working through with our industry colleagues. So this acronym TRIR goes by a lot of different acronyms all around the world, right? So what I'm talking about here is safety being measured as injury rates. Stateside, we call recordable incidents. There's a specific definition that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, manages as to when an incident is recordable and when it is not. But simply, the predominant metric that's been around for about 45 years is this count of injuries that meet that recordability status, divided by the total number of worker hours in the period, and normalized by 200,000 hours, right? So for the non-safety oriented folks on this call, the reason we normalize by 200,000 is it's approximately equal to 100 people working full-time in a year. So that number that this equation spits out, this TRIR, it's a rate in incidents per 200,000 worker hours, and it roughly represents the percentage of full-time employees who have sustained a recordable injury. Now, the thing is, when we look at that metric, this is the king of all metrics out there in terms of how industry is using this in most developed countries. The way that it's used is primarily as a comparative metric, right? So we're measuring and tracking a company's performance. So you might have corporate targets from one quarter to the next, 1 year to the next, or, heaven forbid, 1 month to the next month. A lot of companies will use it to benchmark against their peers. They'll say, my TRIR is this number, what is yours? They compare business units. But the most egregious use of this metric, the one that has, I think, the biggest negative impact on the way safety is managed, is that number is the primary number that is used to pre-qualify and select contractors. So clients will decide which contractors they will even allow to bid based on their injury rates. And then even within companies, this number is very often used in performance evaluations. So you could have, for example, a business unit's recordable injury rate, or even a project's recordable injury rate, being tied to bonuses and incentives. So you can imagine, when it all boils down, and we're talking about the construction industry at large, those last two bullets heavily influence people's behavior. So if you could imagine, one recordable injury will, pre-qualify you out of being able to bid for contracts. Your tendency to maybe hide that incident or try to case manage that incident so that it's not recordable, you have a pretty high incentive to do that, right? To stay in business. And the same with performance evaluations. If my big bonus as a corporate executive is tied to a recordable injury rate, I might be a little bit more incentivized to pressure my team to, maybe not go to the hospital for that particular case if we can try to handle it ourselves, and so on. So there have been some pretty interesting and pretty compelling arguments against using injury rates of all kinds. So whether it's TRIR or some other form of an injury rate based on a different type of injury, these tend to have the same, general characteristics from a philosophical and numerical standpoint, right? So people have made good arguments of why not to use injury rates as a metric of safety. One is that it's misaligned with modern definitions. So you might have heard safety is the presence of safeguards, not the absence of injuries, right? Some companies will say that, and then in the same breath, they'll go over and say, well, we measure recordable injury rate. And like, well, you can't have both of those things, right? You can't believe this safety is a presence of safeguards and then measure safety as the absence of injuries. It's not compatible, right? The other is lots of research out there across, around the world has shown that there's severe underreporting of incidents. And so these numbers we get, we don't even know if they're meaningful, right, representations of the whole. And at best, injury rates we found statistically and behaviorally, they promote reactive behavior, meaning what companies do is an injury, you get a spike or a rash of injuries, and then the company will throttle the safety system in response to that. It's very rare, actually, that you'll find a company that is improving their injury performance by doing better things. They try to do better things in response to poor injury rates. So it's actually the leading lagging indicator relationship is flipped from what we expected or what we had hoped, right? And then lastly, all recordable injuries are counted the same. So you could get a 2-stitch cut to the finger or have a small piece of debris removed from your eye, and that's going to be counted the same as an amputation or a fatality. And that doesn't feel right, right, philosophically, I think, to most of us. So our question, and I'll keep this relatively brief, but our question was, in addition to those philosophical issues, right, which are compelling, to what extent is that number even statistically meaningful? The way we use it as a comparative number, right? Is one company better than another? Should I select one contractor or subcontractor over another, given their injury history? Is that a statistically meaningful thing to do? And so you can see the questions here. The sub questions are, to what extent are there meaningful patterns or feedback loops in the data? Meaning, are there any predictable patterns in recordable injury rate? How do we compare two records, and how do we correctly interpret that number? And so we assembled a team of both, industry practitioners and academics. It was myself and one of my PhD students, Rico Salas, and also a mathematical statistician from our psychology and neuroscience department, Matt Jones, and then some executive level folks from our member companies. So what we ended up doing, which was quite, interesting, I think, is because we had so many collaborating organizations, we were able to access enormous amounts of data. So we ended up having 17 years of data from about 68 companies. And so it totaled 3.2 trillion worker hours worth of exposure time and about 26,000 recordable injuries. So quite a large data set. We ran 2 major statistical tests. One was generalized linear modeling to understand the extent to which recordable injury rate was predictive of itself, right? Past injury rate predicting future injury rate, and also to learn the extent to which recordable injury rate and fatality rate were linked. And then the other major statistical tests we ran were a series of simulations, some Monte Carlo simulations and some others, to understand the extent to which recordable injuries are random. And what we found is that the TRIR is not predictive of itself, meaning a company with a lower recordable injury rate doesn't necessarily have a lower recordable injury rate in the future, which is what we assume whenever we use that number to make these types of decisions. Just as important, I think, there is no association statistically between recordable injury rate and fatality rate, or the number of recordables and fatalities. So they seem to be completely decoupled statistically, happening, presumably for different reasons. And then the most important thing related to the rest of this, presentation here is that the timing when a recordable injury happens is about 98% random. So what that means is it's not perfectly random, but it's pretty darn close. So if you've ever looked up flipping a coin, like flipping a coin is not perfectly random either. It's a 50.8% chance that the coin will land on the same side you flipped it from. I learned that just recently, right? So recordable injuries are about as random as flipping a coin. And the best analogy I can give you is, I'll give you this analogy here. So imagine you have a 6-sided die, right? And you were to roll it 10 times. And so this actually happened. Okay, you roll the die 10 times and you find the average of your rolls, right? So you total it up, divide it by 10. So the person rolling die 1 rolled it 10 times, got a total score of 45, an average score of 4.5, right? And so what I would ask is, you only rolled it 10 times. But if you look at this, if you look at the person who rolled die 3, and let's say a higher number is better, right? Well, the person rolling die 1 must have been a better roller than the one that rolled die 3, right? And we know that's not true. It's the same system, it's the same 6-sided die. It's just because of randomness, we ended up with 2 different outcomes. Now, if I rolled 1,000 times, and this is from a simulator, right? I still will get significant differences. Look at die 1 and die 3. 3.1 and 3.9 appear to be very different, yet they're the exact same system, right? And it's not until you start rolling it about 10,000 times that you tend to find that statistical convergence and the fact that your die are designed to give you an outcome of 3.5. The point is, if you don't roll the die enough times, you don't know actually what it's designed to produce. Okay. Now we could, because we can actually look at it and inspect it, but a safety program is not like that. We have to wait for the outcomes to come in to start to diagnose. And so the analogy carries a bit further. So imagine instead of a 6-sided die, you have a 200,000 sided die, and 199,999 of those sides is 0, and one of them is a 1. And you can imagine how many times you would have to roll that die to figure out exactly what that distribution is, if that makes sense. And so what we found is, because it's so rare and so random, the distribution of recordable injuries follows a Poisson distribution. Poisson distribution represents generally rare and very rare and random events, right? And so following the Poisson distribution, we can actually take a look and actually compute how many worker hours do we need before that number actually has statistical meaning at a significance level. So let's take the most common one. If I wanted to report my recordable injury rate to 1 decimal point, now normally people report it to 2, but if I only wanted to report it to 1, and let's say my recordable injury rate was 1, right? 1 per 200,000 worker hours. I would be, to make that a statistically significant conclusion, right? A statistically confident conclusion, it would have to be derived from 307 plus million worker hours of exposure time. But what we have companies doing is making these same judgments and reporting to 2 decimal places when they only have, say, 300,000 worker hours, right? So we're a far, far cry from the amount of data we would need to make a reasonable judgment. And what this all really means is that for almost any practical purpose, using a recordable injury rate to reward people or select one contractor over another contractor, all we're really doing is rewarding random variation. We're not actually rewarding a better safety system. So, that's quite problematic in business when, companies are pretty confidently making big decisions that affect millions, billions of dollars worth of infrastructure spending on a number that is truly carries almost no statistical meaning, in addition to all of those philosophical problems that I mentioned before as well, right? Like underreporting and case management and, so on and so forth. And so I do want to recognize something though, because we've been looking into alternative metrics for a long time. Recordable injury rate's been around for a long time and still continues to be powerful to this day, for good reason. Number one, it's objective, right? We know when an injury happens, it can follow a definition, can be assessed against that definition, etc. The second is that it's highly comparable. It's the one thing in safety that major geographical areas do exactly the same way. The only thing, by the way, that they do exactly the same way because they're mandated by the government to do it that way, all right? And it's even arguable that they are doing it the same way, but that's the point, is that it is highly comparable across organizational boundaries. It's clear and easy to understand, an injury happened or it didn't happen, according to this metric. And then, it is true that the frequency of injuries is important. It's our ultimate goal to reduce injuries. So whatever we do as alternative metrics have to replicate these strengths, or we might as well not do them. And to give you a good, for my safety colleagues on the call, we've been talking leading indicators a really long time, but they've largely failed at the board level and at the executive level. And the main reason is that if you go into a board meeting with board members who have to look after where the company is positioned relative to other companies that exist in the world, right? They have to look out at the investment level, which is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of decisions. If you give them leading indicators that are bespoke to the particular company and they can't make that external comparison, they ignore them, and they should, because they need to make comparisons relative not to how the company is doing to itself, but how the company is doing relative to the rest of the world. And we do want to see safety included in those types of discussions. But if we don't have an apples to apples comparison, we simply won't get there. So what I want to leave you with, and I'm not going to go into the details of a whole brand new metric because that's a whole other work, a whole other presentation. But I want you to think about this picture. And if I were to ask you a question, how safe is this job? Right? If we think about how we've measured safety in the past, the way we would measure this would be to wait until the work was done, count how many injuries happened, divide it by time, and multiply by 200,000, right? And at best, we are answering how safe was the job, looking in the rear view mirror, right? And I think we can all look at this picture and say this job isn't perfectly safe or unsafe, probably somewhere in between, right? And we can look at it and say it's not perfectly safe. But the most common outcome on this project, what we would expect is, given the limited nature of scope of that work, is 0 injuries, right? But that number, the recordable injury rate of 0, would have indicated philosophically that was perfect when it wasn't. And so what we're moving towards is a metric that looks at, well, how do we do an inventory of the safeguards that are present, especially those against life-threatening hazards? And so we've been working on definitions of, well, what are the life-threatening hazards and what aren't? And what makes for an adequate level of control against those life-threatening hazards? And as you can imagine, just to show you a little preview here, if you did an inventory, here are the hazards. And then you had a definition, and we do have that, a definition of what makes something life-threatening versus not. And then you do an inventory against, you know, a specific control definition. You can begin to assess the safety of any work that's ongoing based on the presence of the safeguards that are there. So just wanted to give you that as a little bit of a preview of the future. It's something we're still working on. I'd say it's academically immature at this stage, but a whole lot of research going into it right now. We're pouring a lot of our research team effort, time, energy, and resources in trying some new things. So I'll leave it at that, Fred. I could go on and on, as you know, but I won't, I promise. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Matt. Colleagues, we've had 2 very different presentations. We've had Yingbin looking at dashboards and management therein, and I have a question about that. And Matt, looking at how we sometimes are using metrics for prediction when we really shouldn't, because they're not predictive, and also reiterating the thing that just because we've measured something in a certain way for a long time doesn't mean it was a good idea to start with. Particularly with the advent of big data, how that's coming on. Does anyone have any questions for our last 6 minutes here? Billy, go right ahead, sir. And Mike, then we'll follow. Go on, Billy.
Yeah, thanks to both presenters. I also read the research that Matt referred to about flipping a coin, about the side that faces up is 50.8% time. Seemingly it's because the side facing up is in the air a fraction longer, which is just blows your mind, doesn't it? But just that was just as a side. The question I have brings both presentations together, and it's how metrics are used in procurement, specifically for selection purposes and particularly pre-qualification. And the problem, the criticism of trying to measure anything other than the cost, sorry, not the cost, the price submitted for procurement purposes for tender, is that over time, if it's not objective enough, people get to understand the vocabulary to use in the pre-qualification or the tender. They get to know the certification required or the badge that's needed to get the 100% maturity, whether it's on safety or whether it's on sustainability. And when everyone reaches that equilibrium, the only differential is the price. So the question is, what metrics do you think stand the test of time, whether it's safety or whether it's sustainability, that genuinely do measure what they should know, valid and reliable measures of the thing that you're trying to differentiate during your procurement?
Thanks, Billy. Yingbin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's cost, it's that's the core for the core concern of any company. So it is that the projects that we have done, we mainly look at the process, the the management and procurement process. But one of the project that we're currently doing, which is the reducing embodied carbon through procurement. In that project, in the current project, we're trying to look at how the cost and sustainability outcomes that balanced and considered in the procurement process, operations of the procurement, like the supplier selection and the procurement criteria, and how that would be embedded into the contract and procurement call for tenders or call for pre-qualifications and these kind of documents. It is the very hard part. I mean the how to express that in terms of price. At the moment, from my knowledge, either the public organizations or private organizations rely on some of the qualitative assessment, qualitative criteria in those procurement process. Pricing those could be very difficult, and especially if it was about the social impact. So some of the sustainability impact and environmental cost or carbon emission or carbon price, that has some ways to determine, but for the social impact, it is also as many just a qualitative assessment.
Okay. Thanks, Yingbin. Matt?
Yeah, sure. Billy, it's a great question. I think it's one I've been struggling with myself from the safety perspective. Is we definitely want safety to be, I think philosophically, we want safety to be considered in, major business decisions so that it's promoted, right, at equal with quality and schedule and cost and everything else. But I think what companies generally are doing nowadays is they're really looking for an easy answer. They're looking for one number, right? They want an index. They want CEOs and board members have very short attention spans. So you've got 3 minutes on the agenda in the board meeting to talk about safety. I mean, it's not enough time to get in anything meaningful, right? So I think right now the battle isn't so much about the metrics, but at the amount of time that organizations are actually willing to put into doing their assessments. Because take, for example, I think you get a lot more looking at 5 pre-job safety briefs to see how good they are than you would at looking at their recordable injury rate for the last month. So it's a bit of a pessimistic view, I think, in terms of where we are with respect to safety. But I am optimistic about the future, because I think there's a really big desire, especially among the clients, of doing better. Because the clients sometimes get a bad rap because, it's easy to point a finger at them, but they are eager to find better ways. So, yeah, that's my take.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Billy, as well. I'm going to turn now to Mike. Go for it, sir.
Yeah, thanks. 2 really nice presentations. Thank you so much. Just very thought-provoking. I think there's, Fred, I hope I can ask 2 questions, maybe, one of each presenter.
As long as they're small and quick. I see a lot of synergies between these 2 presentations and these 2 topics. Again, great presentations. Yingbin, I was wondering if, after kind of listening to Matt's presentation, but, do you see health, safety, and well-being as an integral part of sustainability metrics? And was that included in your project at all?
Well, health and safety, that was part of the social impact of their practices, but we don't have anything to specifically measure health and safety. But this is the part of their sustainability considerations.
Yeah. So maybe Matt's work is going to positively impact your work and the global picture in the future. And I think that's really exciting. So Matt, I love the slides that you showed. The one about the injury rate metric with the red arrows all going down and then the green arrows going up. And so I've always been of the ilk that, and I think you said it really well about how organizations are they're really pressured into kind of looking good by these rates. And I just, deep in my heart, I wonder if these statistics, these injury and illness statistics, could actually be valid and reliable. In other words, if organizations were actually ethically reporting the true state of affairs, if that were true, and I know that's a big if, but if that were true, do you think that maybe you would have come up with a different answer, a different result? So, it's statistically invalid, but could it be valid? Could it be reliable? And I know that's a big if, but and where I'm going with this, Matt, is that in my heart, I think and hope that, because I'm optimistic that companies are going to actually be ethical about it in the future. And I just wonder if I don't know if you can produce some type of a futuristic scenario. And that it's a loaded question, I know, but
It's a good question. If you don't mind, the way I kind of tease it apart is, I think so. We have like the statistics are what they are, meaning I'll give you an example of something that's just ridiculous, right? Imagine you had one reportable injury and it was over 1,000 worker hours, right? Just over a short period, you'd end up with this crazy number, 200, right? Or you could go a long period without having any injuries. And so I think when it comes strictly from like valid and reliable from a numbers perspective, I think our major issue with that number is it's exceedingly rare, right? 1 out of 200,000 is a very, very small number. So what happens is that companies, especially small companies, you just don't have enough time. You don't have enough hours. You don't have enough rolls of the dice to know what that number meaning. So what happens is we look at a company, and even big ones, you go month to month and it does this. So you go from looking perfect to horrible to perfect to horrible. And I get phone calls. Matt, I had 2 recordables last month and now everything's off the rails. I'm like, nothing changed in the safety system. You just have that random variation. But I do think that injury rates, I don't think that they're necessarily causing completely bad behavior. I do think that they can motivate good behavior. That, in a way, companies desire to be safe and reduce those injuries if altruistic, right, to protect people. I do think that pressure to have a low injury rate can lead to positive behavior. So I don't think that they're all bad. I just think that lagging indicators and injury rates in general just need to be put in the proper place. So I'll give you an example. Instead of using a recordable injury rate from month to month to month to month, which companies do, take a 12 or 18-month rolling average and look at the trend. Smooth it out and use it in a statistically valid way. It's less convenient and more difficult to explain, but then that trend, and what you're doing is you're making decisions based on trends. Am I trending up over time, down over time, and not overreacting to aberrant statistical changes? So companies are just throttling up and down, and the safety program is just being squeezed and relaxed and squeezed and relaxed. And so I think it just can be done better. But I don't think no matter what we do, we can't make recordable injury rate meaningful over a short time. It just will never numerically have that possibility.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great response, and I appreciate that. And I think I can just reflect. Fred, I'll be short here. I reflect back on kind of my days in industry and working for a large kind of global corporation where every month, Matt, the organizations would report what they did for the month, and the corporation put out a list from highest to lowest. And my senior VP would come to me and say, what's going to keep me up at night? And I would say, and this is back in the 90s, I would say, It's the people at the top of the list who are 0.0 because they're lying about it and they're hiding things. They're not learning. They're not doing what you were talking about in the first slide. And the people at the bottom of the list are actually being honest. And we shouldn't be, you know, we shouldn't be slapping them on the hand because they're being honest. And it just always bothers me, you know, to me, it comes down to ethics, you know, it comes down to being ethical, right? So it just bothers me, the construction sector, about how we select contractors, and I'll get off my soapbox. But no, great presentations, and you know, just thank you so much.
I think I mean, I've had this very same experience, Mike, with this. Like, you never know when the number comes in. Is this real or not real? Is this a company that's hiding some stuff? Is this a good number because it's good, or because they're not telling me? And vice versa. Is it a high number because people are really open in that company and people are getting care? Or is it a high number because the wheels are off the bus, right? But I think you're right, it is an ethical issue.
I'm going to ask Emmanuel's question in a minute, but you'll find this is why there's a whole chapter on ethics in here, Mike. It's a great textbook about construction management written by an awesome woman.
Well, I also get my ethics stuff from some Australians and Canadian or Northern Irish people too. So
exactly, but ethics in construction, we can only hope. Emmanuel.
So my question just got wrapped up when Mike was finishing his. So then it becomes a comment, because I've been doing some work with some contractors who only take on people on the approved contractor list based on having 0 accidents in their history. And that is not practical. So if you've been doing everything right and looking at numbers that you're putting up, there will be so many variables and parameters that could cause accidents, right? So if it happens that it's a genuine freak of nature, you know, something went wrong, would I be stupid to admit that I've got an accident? Because, you know, it means I will not be getting any job afterwards.
Yeah.
So yeah, Mike wrapped that up with his bit, so it just became a bit of a rant and a comment at the same time. So thank you, Matt.
You're welcome, Emmanuel. Yingbin and then Billy, and then I think I'm going to wrap this up, folks. But Yingbin, go ahead now.
Our question to Matt. It's about safety metrics. So Matt, you have talked about very interesting findings, like a random number for the safety record statistics. Now we see lots of researchers, or many researchers, they are using that kind of lagging indicators or safety records to compare, to draw some conclusions, the statistical conclusions, of that, including myself. I've done that before. So it looks like it's no longer valid from your point of view, or what do you suggest for this kind of research, or how should we use that kind of metrics in the future to try to make our research findings more valid?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because when we got the data back, we didn't know what we were going to find statistically. You know, I didn't think it was going to be as extreme as it was. But my first reaction was, oh crap, how many papers did I write that have recordable injury rate as a lagging variable, right? And so I had to go back, and it's a lot. And so I was having lunch with my colleague, Matt Jones, the statistician. And I was like, Matt, you know, what is this? You know, help me make sense of what this means with respect to the research and the findings, right? What things are predictive and what aren't. And the answer was actually counterintuitive. I originally thought, all right, look, it's rare and random, right? So as a metric, that's why I said from an industry perspective, it's not a great metric over short times, because it's very difficult to discern patterns, right? On something that's rare and random. But he said, look, if you have enough data, or you're trying to correlate with something that has some pattern, it's only 2%, but it has some pattern to it. What that means is, as a dependent variable, it's just a very difficult dependent variable to work with, because to detect an effect size, And something that rare and random is going to require tons and tons of data, right? So what he said was many of the things that people have found over the years that do correlate with things like injury rates, fatality rates, and so on, may actually be more powerful, may have a larger effect size than what we originally thought. But it's actually much less likely that it has a lower effect size, right? Because if you can detect a pattern or predict if some correlation to that number over a long time period, it has to be a relatively powerful connection between the two variables. So it's a long way. I know, Fred, I'm supposed to be quite short here, but it was a completely counterintuitive thing. I didn't realize that until he mentioned it. He's like, actually, it doesn't invalidate that everybody's previous work, but it might draw into question of whether or not those effect size estimates are correct. It might actually be stronger. And so that's why they were saying you need shorter term metrics. You need things you can monitor over shorter time periods if you're going to make those assessments. Lagging indicators are never really going to give you a clear answer. So I wouldn't throw everything away. I was very relieved by that answer. But it does raise a lot of question marks for future research, which is good.
Interesting. I obviously zoned out at the word variable there because that involves numbers. Right, excellent. Billy, I'm going to ask you for a belting last question, my fellow coordinator. Go for it.
Thanks, Fred. I'm glad that of Matt's last comments there. I've also used accident rates as a dependent variable many times in the past. This is more of a comment than a question, Fred, so hopefully it'll help you draw to a conclusion. Matt had mentioned that, rather than metrics, that spending time to deal with it, how organizations perform and safety is probably a better option, but time is money, of course. But I was struck by Ying Ben's approach to the sustainability maturity model, which obviously does need time. It needs time to speak to your supply chain, investigate them, audit them, and whatever. And funnily enough, when you look at one of the best performing safety programs in the UK and indeed the world, was the London 2012 Olympics build program, first ever Olympics build program with 0 fatalities. And if you speak to the head of safety for there, Lawrence Waterman, he says the exact same thing. And it's difficult to do this, to convince your CEOs of this. He said they essentially ignored the accident rates and spent time with the supply chain to work out who were the good guys, the bad guys, and who they should choose to work with. Essentially, procurement by negotiation, and that worked for them. And why has that not been the gold standard? Why has that not been adopted worldwide? It's not. I said it wasn't a question. I ended on a question. Sorry, it's a rhetorical question.
And I think, I'm quite happy with that, Billy, because what that does is juxtaposes against kind of a very kind of technological idea around big data and metrics and needing to know things very, very quickly, when actually where we've kind of come to a conclusion as a group here is that actually it's the investment of time and actually reflecting on things, looking at things. Yingbin mentioned a lot of qualitative elements that go into that work. I think that's I think that is a nice takeaway. I'm happy with that takeaway when I set this particular topic. It's one I can get behind for sure. So thank you all so very much for joining us. We are recording it, so I strongly suspect many folks will review it, and it will be going onto the CIB YouTube channel. So we'll hopefully spread this message further and wider than it has. But I agree, I liked Matt's comments, small but mighty in terms of a webinar. And thank you all very much for joining in. So I hope to see you all soon, speak to you all soon. Everybody take care for the rest of your day, evening, lunchtime, wherever you may be. All right. Thank you all very much. Take care.
Thanks, Fred. Excellent.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now. Bye, y'all.